Nathan Whitmore believed that power could silence consequences. The candlelight inside the River Cafe shimmered against the glass walls, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The Brooklyn Bridge glowed behind him like a crown he thought he deserved. A $900 bottle of Bordeaux breathed between him and Sienna Blake, who sat across from him in a silk black dress, her fingers lightly resting near his Rolex as she laughed at something he barely remembered saying. He felt untouchable. His company's IPO roadshow had gone flawlessly that morning on Wall Street. Investors had applauded. Analysts had praised his visionary leadership. His iPhone kept lighting up with congratulatory texts. He muted them. Tonight wasn't about business. It was about escape. Sienna leaned closer. "In 3 weeks, you'll be worth $500 million," she whispered. "You deserve to celebrate." Deserve. Nathan smiled, the kind of smile built from ambition and carefully buried guilt. Then the restaurant doors opened. He didn't notice at first. The maitre d' did. The conversations at nearby tables softened. A subtle shift in the room, a current moving through the air. Nathan looked up, and the blood drained from his face. Clara Whitmore stood at the entrance, 7 months pregnant, one hand resting gently on her stomach, her navy coat draped with quiet elegance. No tears, no trembling. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Julian Cross, the Julian Cross, founder of Cross and Vale Capital, the lead institutional investor backing Nathan's IPO, the man whose signature would determine whether Nathan's company soared or collapsed overnight. Julian's gaze locked onto Nathan's. Calm, assessing, unreadable. Since Sienna's fingers slowly withdrew from Nathan's wrist, Clara didn't storm toward the table. She walked with measured grace, and when she finally stopped in front of him, her voice was steady enough to cut glass. "Don't get up," she said softly. "You're exactly where you need to be." In that moment, Nathan understood something terrifying. He wasn't being caught. He was being cornered. 3 months earlier, Clara Whitmore still believed distance was temporary. The first sign was small. Nathan began closing his MacBook Pro the moment she entered the room. At first, she smiled about it, teasing him for guarding investor secrets, like a spy in a spy movie. He laughed, kissed her forehead, and said, "It's just pre-IPO pressure." She wanted to believe that. But pressure doesn't change passwords overnight. One Tuesday morning, while ordering nursery furniture for the baby, her American Express card declined. Clara stared at the screen in confusion. There was no warning, no discussion. Just a quiet notification. Transaction denied. Nathan apologized that night. "Temporary fraud alert," he explained smoothly. "Finance tightened everything before IPO. It's procedural." Procedural. The next week, her access to the company's internal dashboard disappeared. She had once helped him structure early financial models, sitting beside him at their kitchen island in Tribeca, spreadsheets glowing under soft pendant lights. She wasn't just a wife back then. She was part of the build. Now she was locked out. When she asked why, Nathan sighed like she was being unreasonable. "Clara, you're 7 months pregnant. You don't need stress. Let me handle it." Handle it. The word echoed long after he left for a strategy dinner at the Ritz-Carlton. Clara sat alone in the penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, one hand resting on her stomach as the baby shifted gently beneath her palm. She opened a copy of The 48 Laws of Power on her Kindle, something she had started reading after sensing the shift in him. Law 3. Conceal your intentions. Her chest tightened. Nathan had stopped arguing, stopped explaining, stopped fighting. He had simply begun rearranging the board. Trust accounts quietly established. Assets transferred under holding structures she didn't recognize. Legal language sliding into conversations like invisible ink. She wasn't being abandoned emotionally. She was being erased strategically. The realization didn't come with screaming or shattered glass. It came with silence. Clara closed the Kindle and stared at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, her husband was building a future. And for the first time, she understood something that made her stomach drop harder than fear ever could. He wasn't building it with her in it. If Nathan Whitmore was building an empire, Sienna Blake was designing the illusion that protected it. She understood something Nathan never fully admitted to himself. Success wasn't only about numbers, it was about narrative. They first grew close inside a glass-walled boardroom on Park Avenue, where the city looked small beneath them. Sienna had been hired as an external PR strategist ahead of the IPO. She arrived with a leather portfolio, a Mont Blanc pen, and a presentation titled, "The Human Face of FinTech Leadership." Nathan had laughed at the phrase. By the end of the meeting, he was repeating it in interviews. "Investors don't just buy performance," Sienna had said smoothly, tapping her iPad to advance slides filled with carefully curated headlines. "They buy character, stability, vision. You need to look like a man who has everything aligned. Business and family. Family." The word lingered in the air longer than Nathan expected. Within weeks, professional photos of Nathan and Clara appeared in financial magazines. Carefully staged shots in their Tribeca penthouse, Clara's hand resting lightly over her baby bump, Nathan's arm around her waist. Headlines praised him as a devoted husband preparing for fatherhood while steering a billion-dollar IPO. Clara hadn't even known the photographer was coming until 30 minutes before the shoot. "It's good optics," Nathan had insisted. Optics. Meanwhile, Sienna became a constant presence. Strategy dinners at the Plaza Hotel, late-night media rehearsals, private investor mixers, where she stood slightly behind Nathan, whispering adjustments before he stepped onto a stage lit with Wall Street ambition. She knew which tie he should wear, which childhood story to mention, which vulnerability would make him appear relatable but not weak. What she never revealed was the second narrative she was quietly drafting. In encrypted emails stored separately from company servers, Sienna outlined a contingency plan. If scandal surfaces, pivot to executive stress. Emphasize pregnancy strain. Position wife as emotionally overwhelmed. She wasn't just protecting Nathan. She was protecting herself. Because buried inside compensation documents was a clause granting her equity bonuses tied directly to valuation milestones. If Nathan soared, she profited. If Nathan fell, she needed a parachute. And somewhere between managing headlines and manufacturing devotion, Sienna stopped seeing Clara as a wife. She began seeing her as a variable. Back at the River Cafe, silence spread faster than scandal. Nathan slowly pushed his chair back, instinctively rising despite Clara's quiet command. Across from him, Sienna kept her posture controlled, but her pulse betrayed her. She recognized Julian Cross immediately. Everyone in high finance did. His firm, Cross and Vale Capital, wasn't just a backer of the IPO. It was the backbone holding Nathan's valuation upright. Julian did not smile. "Mr. Whitmore," he said evenly, extending a hand that felt less like a greeting and more like a summons. "I hope we're not interrupting." Nathan forced a tight grin. "Julian, what a surprise." "It shouldn't be," Julian replied. "I asked Clara to join me for dinner tonight." The words landed like a controlled detonation. Nathan's gaze snapped to Clara. She held it calmly. There were no tears in her eyes, no trembling lips, just clarity. "You invited my wife?" Nathan asked, unable to hide the strain in his voice. Julian's expression didn't shift. "I prefer to meet with all stakeholders before finalizing capital commitments." Stakeholders. The word hung heavily between them. Sienna's fingers tightened around her wine glass. She understood the language instantly. This wasn't a confrontation. It was leverage. Clara placed her purse gently on the edge of the table, her movements unhurried. "Nathan," she said softly, "Julian had questions about certain trust transfers made last month." Nathan's heartbeat thudded in his ears. Trust transfers. He had moved assets quietly, restructuring ownership beneath layers of holding companies. It had been strategic, legal, protective. But hearing it spoken here, in public, shifted the power dynamic. Julian folded his hands. "Before Cross and Vale releases the second tranche of funding, we need transparency, particularly regarding spousal equity displacement." Sienna inhaled sharply. She hadn't been briefed on this. Nathan felt the room closing in. Investors at nearby tables were beginning to recognize faces. Phones were subtly angled. Conversations slowed. This wasn't about infidelity anymore. It was about control. Clara met his eyes one final time. "You were rearranging the board," she said quietly. "You just forgot I was still on it." For the first time since the IPO announcement, Nathan Whitmore realized something terrifying. The most dangerous move hadn't been made by his mistress. It had been made by his wife. The dinner ended without shouting. That was the part that unsettled Nathan most. Clara didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She simply stood, thanked Julian for the evening, and left the restaurant with a quiet composure that felt more dangerous than fury. Julian followed her out, his expression unreadable as Manhattan's cold air swallowed them both. Nathan remained seated. Sienna leaned closer. What trust transfers was she talking about? His jaw tightened. Internal restructuring, nothing illegal. But even as he said it, doubt flickered. The next morning, Nathan arrived at his glass tower office on Wall Street earlier than usual. The stock ticker on the lobby screen rolled upward in green optimism. Analysts were still projecting a successful IPO. On paper, everything looked pristine, until his general counsel walked into the boardroom with a sealed envelope. "It came through compliance at 6:12 a.m., she said quietly, "flagged by Cross and Vale's audit division." Nathan's pulse accelerated. Inside the envelope was a document he hadn't expected anyone outside his inner circle to see, a revised spousal equity agreement. The amendment showed Clara's shares diluted and transferred into a holding trust controlled solely by him. Dated 6 weeks ago, digitally notarized, and bearing Clara's electronic signature. Sienna, standing near the window, felt the shift instantly. "That's not possible," she murmured. Nathan stared at the signature. It was Clara's, but it wasn't. He remembered the night clearly. She had been asleep on the couch, exhausted, one hand resting over her stomach. He had accessed shared credentials from her old company laptop, rationalizing that he was protecting the company, protecting their future. Now the document sat on the table like evidence in a courtroom. His counsel spoke again. "Cross and Vale is questioning whether the transfer constitutes coercive dilution of a marital stakeholder prior to IPO disclosure." Coercive? The word hit harder than scandal. If this surfaced publicly, it wouldn't be framed as a strategic adjustment. It would be framed as financial misconduct. Across the table, Sienna's expression changed. For the first time, she wasn't calculating optics, and she was calculating risk. And Nathan Whitmore finally understood something chilling. This wasn't about a jealous wife. It was about a paper trail. Nathan didn't go home that night. Instead, he booked a suite at the Plaza Hotel under the pretense of damage control meetings. The city lights spilled through the tall windows as he stood alone, jacket discarded, tie loosened, staring at the reflection of a man who suddenly looked less invincible. By morning, his attorneys had drafted the countermove. If Clara wanted to weaponize equity transfers, he would escalate. At 9:14 a.m., Clara received the notification on her phone while sitting in a quiet corner of a prenatal clinic on the Upper East Side. Petition for dissolution of marriage, filed by Nathan Whitmore. Grounds: irreconcilable differences and concerns regarding emotional stability during pregnancy. Her fingers trembled only once before she steadied them. Emotional stability. The narrative unfolded exactly as Sienna had once outlined in those contingency emails. Nathan wasn't just protecting assets. He was preemptively discrediting her. By noon, financial restrictions followed. Joint accounts temporarily frozen pending asset review. Access to certain investment portfolios suspended. The penthouse in Tribeca, technically held under a corporate structure, was listed as executive housing. Clara read each clause slowly on her MacBook Air, her breathing controlled despite the weight pressing against her chest. He was building a case. If he established instability, he could argue primary custodial authority once the baby was born. The cruelty of it wasn't loud. It was procedural. Later that afternoon, her attorney called. "He's requesting a psychological evaluation as part of the filing," he said carefully. "It's strategic intimidation." Clara closed her eyes. 7 months pregnant, financially restricted, public narrative turning fragile. The board was shifting fast, but Nathan had miscalculated one thing. He assumed she would panic. Instead, Clara opened a secure cloud folder she had created weeks earlier. Inside were time-stamped emails, metadata records, and server logs documenting when her credentials were accessed remotely, long after she had stopped participating in company operations. He thought he was isolating her. He didn't realize she had been quietly documenting everything. Across Manhattan, Nathan believed he had just cornered his wife. What he didn't see was that every move he made was tightening a net around himself. The call from Julian came at 7:42 p.m. Clara was sitting at the kitchen island of the Tribeca penthouse, the skyline dim beyond the glass. Half the lights in the apartment were already disconnected under temporary financial review. The silence felt staged, like the calm before a market crash. "Are you alone?" Julian asked. "Yes." "Good, because what I'm about to tell you changes the board entirely." Clara straightened. Across town, Nathan was in his office reviewing revised IPO timelines when his phone buzzed repeatedly. Not investor messages, not board members, compliance alerts. Simultaneously, an internal memo flagged irregular communications between Sienna Blake and a federal regulatory liaison. Clara listened as Julian spoke carefully. 3 weeks ago, an anonymous tip was submitted to the SEC regarding undisclosed compensation structures tied to your IPO. Her breath caught. "Anonymous?" she whispered. "Yes." The tip included draft versions of Nathan's equity adjustments, including the spousal dilution. Clara's mind raced. Only a handful of people had access to those drafts. Julian paused before delivering the final piece. The metadata on the submission traces back to a private IP registered under Sienna Blake. Silence fell between them. Sienna hadn't just crafted a narrative in case of scandal. She had engineered the scandal. Across the city, Nathan stormed into Sienna's office suite overlooking Fifth Avenue. She was calm, almost too calm, packing a slim leather folder into her bag. "What did you do?" he demanded. Sienna met his fury with steady composure. "I protected myself." "You reported us?" "I reported potential misconduct," she corrected. "You should read the wording carefully." Nathan felt something unfamiliar. Loss of control. "You said you were on my side." "I was," she replied, "until I realized you were building everything under your name. I wasn't going down with you." It wasn't emotional. It was transactional. Back in Tribeca, Clara pressed her palm gently against her stomach as the baby shifted. Julian's voice softened slightly. "He's not just fighting you anymore. He's fighting the regulators. For the first time since the divorce filing, Clara felt the balance tilt. Nathan had tried to discredit her, but someone closer to him had detonated the foundation. And the most dangerous part? Sienna hadn't betrayed him out of love. She had betrayed him out of strategy. The leak hit before sunrise. At 5:18 a.m., the Wall Street Journal published a headline that sliced through Manhattan's financial district like a blade. Whitmore FinTech IPO faces regulatory scrutiny over undisclosed equity transfers. By 6 a.m., CNBC was replaying segments of Nathan's recent interviews, juxtaposed against analysts questioning governance integrity. The same clips that once framed him as a visionary now felt like evidence. Nathan stood inside his office tower on Wall Street, staring at the muted television mounted across from the boardroom table. The stock ticker below flashed pre-market indicators in a sea of red. Investor confidence wasn't collapsing quietly. It was bleeding publicly. His phone vibrated nonstop. Board members, legal counsel, venture partners. One message stood out. Cross and Vale Capital has suspended the second funding tranche, pending full internal audit. Julian hadn't just questioned him over dinner. He had pulled oxygen from the room. Across Manhattan, Clara watched the same news from the living room of the penthouse. She wasn't smiling. There was no satisfaction in her expression. Only stillness. The narrative had shifted overnight. Commentators debated corporate transparency, governance ethics, fiduciary duty. No one was discussing her emotional instability. The market had chosen a bigger scandal. At 9:30 a.m., the opening bell rang. Whitmore FinTech's pre-IPO valuation, once projected at $480 million, dropped nearly 38% in revised private trading within hours. Institutional investors began backing away, citing regulatory exposure. Nathan entered an emergency board meeting in a navy suit that suddenly felt too heavy. Around the polished conference table, directors avoided eye contact. "This is containable," Nathan insisted. "It's a disclosure misunderstanding." But the CFO slid a printed chart across the table. "We've already lost 2 anchor commitments." Outside the building, reporters gathered beneath the glass facade, cameras angled upward. Meanwhile, Sienna's resignation letter circulated quietly through internal channels. Effective immediately. No public explanation. She had exited before the blast radius fully expanded. By afternoon, the IPO roadshow was officially postponed. Nathan walked back into his office alone. 3 weeks ago, he had been celebrated on Wall Street. Now, he wasn't fighting a divorce. He was fighting survival. And for the first time in his career, the market wasn't listening to him anymore. Nathan expected loyalty. What he got was silence. By late afternoon, the Whitmore FinTech headquarters felt hollow. Assistants avoided eye contact. Executives spoke in lowered tones. The once celebrated glass tower on Wall Street now felt like a building under quiet evacuation. Sienna's office was already cleared. No dramatic confrontation. No emotional goodbye. Just a forwarded email from her personal attorney. Ms. Blake has voluntarily agreed to cooperate with federal regulatory inquiries in exchange for limited liability consideration. Nathan read it twice. Limited liability. She hadn't just resigned. She had negotiated immunity. He felt heat rise behind his eyes. Not heartbreak, not betrayal in the romantic sense, but humiliation. Sienna had always positioned herself as strategic, aligned, indispensable. Yet the moment risk outweighed reward, she recalculated. Transactional. Efficient. He slammed his hand against the edge of his desk, the sound sharp against the polished wood. Meanwhile, Clara received a different message. Julian's assistant had scheduled a private meeting at Cross and Vale's Park Avenue office the following morning. The subject line was simple. Next phase. Clara sat quietly in the dim living room, reviewing the news coverage on her MacBook Air. Analysts were no longer debating marital instability. They were discussing executive misconduct and fiduciary breach. Her name had disappeared from headlines. Nathan's had replaced it entirely. For the first time in weeks, she exhaled without tension tightening her chest. But the shift wasn't relief. Well, it was recognition. This was bigger than infidelity. Across town, Nathan's legal counsel entered his office with an update. The SEC has requested preliminary documentation regarding equity transfers and disclosure timing. They're also reviewing compensation agreements tied to PR advisory roles. Compensation agreements. He suddenly understood what Sienna had protected. Equity bonuses tied to valuation spikes, private side agreements, performance triggers. If regulators uncovered structured concealment, he wouldn't just lose the IPO. He could face personal sanctions. The sun dipped below the Manhattan skyline, casting the city in a gold that felt almost mocking. Nathan stared out at the Hudson River. 3 weeks ago, he believed he controlled the narrative. Now the woman he betrayed had vanished from the scandal, and the woman he trusted had vanished from his life. He wasn't standing at the top anymore. He was standing alone. The emergency board meeting began at 8 a.m. sharp. Nathan entered the glass-walled conference room with the controlled stride he had practiced for years. Navy suit, crisp white shirt. The Mont Blanc pen he always carried rested between his fingers, like a symbol of authority. But no one stood when he walked in. The 12-seat mahogany table felt longer than usual. On the far wall, a muted financial news channel replayed yesterday's headline about regulatory scrutiny. No one bothered to turn it off. The chairman cleared his throat. "Let's begin." Nathan launched into his defense immediately. "This is a disclosure timing issue, nothing more. The SEC review is procedural. We remain fundamentally strong." Silence. And then the independent director, a former federal prosecutor, slid a folder across the table. "We've reviewed the amended spousal equity transfer." Nathan's pulse tightened. "It was legally structured," he insisted. "Perhaps," she replied calmly. "But it was not disclosed to key institutional stakeholders before valuation projections were circulated." Another board member leaned forward. "And the side compensation agreement with Ms. Blake?" Nathan's jaw hardened. "Performance-based advisory equity. Standard practice. Not when tied to undisclosed narrative risk mitigation," the chairman said quietly. The room shifted. For the first time since founding the company, Nathan felt the authority draining from him in real time. "We have to protect the company," the CFO said carefully. "Investors are asking whether executive leadership can continue under investigation." Continue under investigation. The words felt like an early obituary. Nathan looked around the table, searching for loyalty. He saw calculation instead. Finally, the chairman spoke the sentence that fractured everything. "The board is voting to place you on temporary administrative leave, pending regulatory outcome." Administrative leave. Not fired. Not yet. But stripped. His voting rights suspended. His executive authority frozen. The Mont Blanc pen slipped from his fingers and rolled slightly across the polished surface. Nathan Whitmore had built this company from a 2-person startup in a rented office. Now, he was being escorted out of his own boardroom. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he caught his reflection in the mirrored wall. 3 weeks ago, he was preparing to ring the IPO bell. Now he wasn't fighting for valuation. He was fighting to keep his name attached to the company at all. While Nathan was being escorted out of his own boardroom, Clara was walking into another one. Cross and Vale Capital occupied the top floors of a steel and glass tower on Park Avenue. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and espresso. Clara moved carefully but confidently, one hand resting against her 7-month belly, her navy coat buttoned neatly, despite the early winter wind outside. Julian was waiting in a private conference room overlooking Midtown. He didn't stand when she entered, not out of disrespect, but because he was studying her. "You look steadier than most executives I've seen this week," he said. "I've had practice," Clara replied calmly. A folder rested in front of her seat. Thick, structured, intentional. Julian slid it closer. "Your husband's board has suspended him. Regulators are requesting supplemental disclosure. But this meeting isn't about him." Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. "It's about you," Julian continued. Inside the folder were documents Clara hadn't seen in months. Original capitalization tables from the company's early days. Her name listed clearly. Founding operational contributor. Initial equity allocation. Nathan had tried to dilute her shares, but he couldn't erase the origin. "You were more than a spouse," Julian said. "You were early architecture." Clara inhaled slowly. "For the record," she replied, "I'm not here for revenge. I want clarity and legal separation. Nothing more." Julian nodded once. "And that's precisely why you're dangerous." He explained that Cross and Vale would require amended disclosures correcting any misleading spousal equity transfers. If properly structured, Clara's original shares would be reinstated under independent trust, beyond Nathan's control. Not as a favor, as compliance. Across town, Nathan was calling every contact he had left. Meanwhile, Clara was regaining something far more powerful than money. Position. Her attorney joined the meeting by secure video. Terms were outlined. Protective custody clauses drafted for the child upon birth. Asset transparency demanded. No yelling, no theatrics, just documentation. When Clara stepped back into the Manhattan air, she felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, stability. Nathan had tried to reduce her to a narrative weakness. Instead, when she had become a regulatory requirement, and in high finance, that was stronger than sympathy. The penthouse in Tribeca didn't feel like home anymore. 3 days after Nathan's suspension, a formal notice arrived from the lending institution that financed the property. The envelope was heavy, embossed, clinical. Clara opened it at the kitchen counter beneath pendant lights that once illuminated late-night strategy sessions and early dreams. Due to pending regulatory investigation and executive suspension, discretionary credit extensions are temporarily frozen. Frozen. The same word that had once restricted her now circled back to him. The property, technically classified as executive housing under a corporate structure Nathan had created, was under financial review. Without active executive authority, the housing designation could not be maintained. Clara read each paragraph slowly. There was no panic, only adjustment. Across Manhattan, Nathan stood inside the same penthouse hours later, speaking sharply into his iPhone. "This is temporary," he insisted to the bank representative. "My leave is procedural." But the response was firm. Until regulatory clarity is restored, asset leverage cannot be extended. Leverage, the very mechanism Nathan had used to build momentum, was now compressing against him. That afternoon, a courier delivered an inventory request. High-value personal assets were to be documented for compliance review. The Rolex he once wore to investor dinners lay on the marble console table, untouched. Designer suits, artwork, from even the limited edition watch collection he displayed during private gatherings, all now categorized as collateral risk. Nathan stared at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The city looked the same, but access felt different. Meanwhile, Clara had already relocated essential documents to a secure safe deposit box on the Upper East Side. Her attorney confirmed that her reinstated equity position would remain independent of corporate housing disputes. For the first time, the imbalance shifted visibly. That evening, movers arrived quietly to remove non-essential furnishings from the penthouse pending valuation review. Neighbors watched discreetly from across the hall. No scandalous headlines, no dramatic collapse, just consequence. Nathan had built layers of protection around himself, assuming control meant immunity. He never anticipated that the same financial structures he used to sideline his wife would activate against him. And as the lights in the penthouse dimmed one by one, he realized something he hadn't felt in years. Exposure. The contractions began just after midnight. Clara had been reviewing revised trust documents at the small rental apartment she'd temporarily moved into on the Upper East Side. The Tribeca penthouse was no longer stable territory, and she refused to bring her child into uncertainty. At first, she thought it was stress. Then the pain tightened again. And again. By the time she reached the hospital, escorted quietly by a car Julian had arranged without asking questions, the winter air outside had turned sharp and metallic. Manhattan felt distant, irrelevant. Inside the maternity wing, everything became simple. Breathe. Count. Focus. The nurses moved with practiced calm. Monitors blinked softly. The room smelled of antiseptic and something clean, something honest. No boardrooms, no headlines, no leverage, just life. Her doctor spoke gently. "You're early, but we're prepared." Clara gripped the edge of the hospital bed as another contraction surged through her. For months, she had been steady, strategic, composed, controlled. Now there was no strategy, only surrender to the moment. Across town, Nathan's phone buzzed with a message from Clara's attorney. "She's in labor." He stared at the text for a long time before responding. "Can I come?" The reply was brief. "She needs stability, not stress." Nathan set the phone down slowly. For the first time, there was nothing he could negotiate. No document to revise. No clause to activate. Inside the delivery room, Clara whispered through clenched breath, "It's okay. We're okay." Whether she was speaking to herself or her son, she wasn't sure. Hours later, as pale morning light crept over the skyline, a cry filled the room. Strong. Clear. Alive. Clara felt tears spill freely as the nurse placed her son against her chest. Tiny fingers curled instinctively. Warm. Real. Everything else, the IPO, the equity, the betrayal, shrank instantly. Julian stood quietly outside the room when the doctor stepped out. "She's stable," the doctor confirmed. Both of them. Stable. The word carried more meaning now than any financial term ever had. In that hospital room, Clara understood something powerful. She hadn't just survived the collapse. She had created something unshakable. Nathan wore a charcoal suit he hadn't worn since his first investor pitch. It still fit perfectly. But it no longer meant anything. The Manhattan family court building stood in sharp contrast to glass towers and skyline views. No polished marble meant to impress investors. No assistants filtering questions. Just fluorescent lights and a long wooden bench where reality was decided without applause. Clara entered holding her newborn son in a cream blanket. She looked composed, though exhaustion lingered beneath her eyes. Motherhood had softened her face, but it had sharpened her resolve. Nathan stood when she walked in. For a moment, neither spoke. The hearing wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No spectacle. Nathan's attorney argued that ongoing regulatory stress and public pressure made Clara's environment unstable for a newborn. He framed it as concern, not accusation. Clara's attorney didn't raise his voice, and he raised documentation. Time-stamped server access logs showing Nathan had used Clara's credentials without consent, evidence of preemptive financial restrictions. The divorce filing dated precisely 1 day after Cross and Vale questioned the equity transfer. The pattern spoke louder than emotion. The judge adjusted her glasses, scanning the file carefully. "Mr. Whitmore," she said evenly, "you filed for divorce citing emotional instability. Yet evidence shows strategic asset manipulation preceding the filing. Nathan felt heat crawl up his neck. It was corporate protection, he said quietly. For whom? The judge asked. Silence. Clara didn't look at him. She looked at her son. The judge continued. Until regulatory investigations conclude, and given documented financial maneuvering that disadvantaged the mother, a primary physical custody will remain with Mrs. Whitmore. Primary custody. The words landed without theatrics. Nathan's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly. He had walked into boardrooms believing authority followed his signature. Here, it followed evidence. Visitation was structured, supervised temporarily, financial transparency mandated, child support calculated based on frozen but declared assets. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered at a distance, but Clara exited through a side door arranged quietly by her attorney. Nathan stepped into the winter air alone. 3 months ago, he controlled headlines. Now he couldn't even control weekends. And for the first time, he understood that power in business could be negotiated. Power in fatherhood could not. The formal notice arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon. Now Nathan was sitting in a temporary office space 3 blocks from his former headquarters. No glass walls, no skyline view. Just a rented desk, a silent phone, and a laptop that no longer connected to the company servers he once controlled. The email subject line was clinical. Final determination. Executive conduct review. He opened it slowly. After a comprehensive review in cooperation with regulatory authorities, the board of directors has voted unanimously to remove Nathan Whitmore as chief executive officer, effective immediately. No ambiguity, no administrative leave. Removed. The statement cited breach of fiduciary transparency and failure to disclose material equity adjustments during pre-IPO valuation discussions. The language was measured, but the message was final. Within hours, some financial media updated headlines. Whitmore FinTech announces leadership transition amid regulatory settlement. Settlement. Nathan wasn't criminally charged. There would be no dramatic arrest, but he agreed to step down permanently and accept a 5-year restriction from serving as an officer or director of a publicly traded company. His name, once synonymous with innovation, now carried a footnote. Across town, Clara read the news while rocking her son near the window of her apartment. The winter light filtered softly across the room. She didn't smile. She simply absorbed it. The man who tried to erase her had been erased from the position he valued most. Not by revenge, by documentation. Later that evening, Nathan stood in front of a mirror in the dim apartment he had downsized to after the penthouse restructuring. The Rolex was gone, liquidated to cover legal expenses. The Mont Blanc pen lay unused on the kitchen counter. He picked up his phone. No congratulatory messages, no board alerts, just silence. For years, he believed success was measured in valuation metrics and IPO projections. Now he understood something he had ignored. Reputation wasn't built by press releases. It was built by character. And once that cracked, no restructuring could restore it. The fall wasn't loud. It was absolute. Sienna Blake believed in positioning. She had always told herself that loyalty was negotiable, but reputation was currency. When she submitted her voluntary cooperation agreement to regulators, she expected to emerge bruised but intact, a strategic survivor in a collapsing structure. For a brief moment, it seemed she might succeed. Her attorney secured limited liability. She wasn't named in any formal enforcement action. The media framed her as a communications consultant who raised compliance concerns. Carefully worded, technically safe. But Wall Street has a long memory. 2 weeks after Nathan's removal, Sienna attended a private networking reception at a midtown rooftop lounge. She wore a tailored black coat, posture straight, confidence measured. Conversations paused slightly when she entered, not in admiration, in assessment. A senior partner she once courted for a media contract nodded politely but didn't approach. Another executive glanced at her, then leaned closer to his colleague and whispered something she couldn't hear, but understood. The whispers were subtle, but constant. Later that evening, her phone buzzed with an email from a boutique PR firm she had been negotiating with. After careful review, we have decided to move in a different direction. Different direction. The phrase repeated itself across multiple inbox notifications over the next week. Consulting contracts stalled. Advisory opportunities disappeared. Invitations stopped arriving. No scandal had formally attached to her name. Yet no one trusted her proximity to power anymore. In high-level corporate culture, betrayal carried an invisible signature. If she could report a CEO when leverage shifted, what would stop her from reporting a client? Sienna sat alone in her apartment overlooking Fifth Avenue, scrolling through news updates on her iPad. Clara's name appeared briefly in a business feature, described as a co-founder contributor reinstated through governance correction. Measured, professional, respectful. Sienna exhaled slowly. She had calculated risk precisely. What she hadn't calculated was perception. Immunity protected her legally. It did not restore credibility. Across Manhattan, doors continued closing quietly, not slammed, just withheld. And for the first time in years, Sienna understood something uncomfortable. In a world built on narrative, the story people believe about you becomes permanent. Spring arrived quietly in Manhattan. Clara noticed it one morning while walking through Central Park, with her son nestled against her chest in a soft gray carrier. The trees were beginning to bloom, and for the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt possible. The regulatory dust had settled enough for Cross and Vale to finalize the equity correction. Clara's original shares, modest compared to what they might have been at IPO peak, were reinstated under an independent trust. Not enough to make headlines, but enough to make choices. She didn't return to corporate finance. Instead, she rented a modest office space near Madison Avenue with large windows and pale wooden floors. A simple brass plaque outside read, "Whitmore Advisory, Financial Clarity for Women in Transition." The name wasn't about Nathan anymore. It was about reclamation. On her desk sat a MacBook Air, a leather notebook, and a framed photo of her son. Clara began working with women navigating divorce, maternity leave, and financial dependency, translating complex legal language into plain truth. No intimidation, no leverage games, just structure. Word spread quietly. Referrals came from attorneys, therapists, even former board members who respected how she handled scrutiny without spectacle. Julian visited one afternoon, standing near the window as Clara reviewed a client file. "You could have taken a seat on 3 boards by now," he observed. "I don't want power," Clara replied evenly. "I want stability." Julian studied her for a moment, then nodded. Stability. The word felt earned now. Across town, Nathan's name faded further from financial media. His replacement CEO rebranded the company. New investors arrived. The market moved on. Clara didn't monitor it anymore. Her success wasn't measured in valuation spikes. It was measured in invoices paid without fear. In nursery laughter echoing through a home she chose herself. In contracts she signed that no one could alter without her consent. One evening, as golden light filtered across her office floor, Clara locked the door and paused. Months ago, she had been fighting not to disappear. Now she had built something no one could restructure away, not because she won, but because she rebuilt. Nathan hadn't stepped inside Central Park in years. When he finally did, it wasn't for a press photo or a charity run. It was because Clara had agreed to meet, publicly, in daylight, where nothing could be misrepresented. He saw her before she saw him. She was sitting on a bench near the reservoir, her son in a stroller beside her, gently rocking it with one hand while reviewing something on her phone. No security detail, no spectacle, just a mother in early spring sunlight. Nathan approached slowly. "No, Clara." She looked up. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, just distance. He sat at the far end of the bench, leaving space between them, a silent acknowledgement that proximity had to be earned now. "I'm not here to argue," he began. His voice sounded different to his own ears, thinner, less certain. "I just needed to say something without attorneys in the room." Clara waited. Nathan exhaled. "I convinced myself I was protecting us, the company, the future. I thought if I controlled everything, nothing could fall apart." He glanced at his son, sleeping peacefully. "But the more I tried to control it, the more I dismantled it." The confession wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, just clarity stripped of ego. "I lost the company," he continued quietly. "But that wasn't the real loss. I built an empire and forgot who I was building it for." Clara studied him for a long moment. "You didn't forget," she said calmly. "You decided." The words landed heavier than accusation. Nathan nodded slowly. She was right. Ambition hadn't distracted him. It had revealed him. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added. "I just want to be present in his life. Properly." Clara looked down at her son, then back at Nathan. "Presence isn't a speech," she replied. "It's consistency." He swallowed, understanding the condition embedded in that sentence. No more grand gestures. No more strategic optics. Just repetition of responsibility. As he stood to leave, Nathan felt something unfamiliar but necessary. Humility. He had spent years commanding rooms. Now he was asking for access. And for the first time, and he knew that access wouldn't be negotiated through power. It would be earned through character. It had been almost a year. Central Park was no longer the place of confrontation. It had become routine. Nathan arrived 10 minutes early this time. Consistency. That was the word Clara had given him. He stood near the same bench by the reservoir, hands in the pockets of a simple wool coat. No Rolex, no tailored power suit, just a man learning how to show up without an audience. Clara approached with their son walking beside her now, small fingers wrapped around hers. He was old enough to take uneven steps, old enough to laugh when pigeons scattered in front of him. "Daddy," the little boy said softly when he saw Nathan. The word landed heavier than any board vote ever had. Nathan crouched to his son's level, careful, patient. "Hey, I'm Buddy." He didn't reach immediately. He waited. The child stepped forward on his own. Clara watched carefully, not tense, just observant. They sat together on the bench. Their son babbled happily, pointing at the water, tugging gently at Nathan's sleeve. Nathan listened, really listened. No phone, no divided attention. After a few quiet minutes, Clara spoke. "You've been consistent," she said. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. Nathan nodded. "I'm trying." She studied him for a moment. The arrogance had softened. The urgency had dissolved. What remained was something steadier, if smaller. "I won't rebuild the past," Clara continued calmly. "But I won't block you from building a relationship with him." Nathan swallowed. "Thank you." She shook her head slightly. "It's not for you. It's for him." The sun began to lower, casting gold across the water. Families passed. Joggers moved by without noticing the history sitting quietly on that bench. Clara stood first. Their son reached for her hand instinctively. Nathan didn't protest. He stood as well, offering a gentle smile to his child. As Clara turned to leave, Nathan felt something settle in his chest. He had lost status. He had lost control. But he hadn't lost the chance to become better. And sometimes, that was the only victory left worth earning. 1 year later, Clara returned to the River Cafe, not because of confrontation, because of closure. The Brooklyn Bridge shimmered against the evening sky, just as it had that night, everything fractured. Candlelight reflected softly across the glass walls. The room still carried the quiet hum of expensive conversation and polished confidence. But this time, Clara walked in without tension in her shoulders. Her son, now steady on his feet, held her hand as they were guided to a table near the window. He pointed excitedly at the water below, unaware that this place once marked the sharpest turn in his mother's life. Julian arrived a few minutes later, not as an investor, not as a strategist, simply as a man who had remained consistent. He greeted her son first, kneeling slightly to meet his eyes. "I hear you like bridges," he said warmly. The child nodded with shy enthusiasm. Clara watched the exchange carefully, not as a woman seeking rescue, but as a mother evaluating character. Dinner was simple, no dramatic declarations, no symbolic speeches, just conversation about work, about growth, about the strange way life rearranges itself when illusion falls away. At one point, Julian reached across the table, not for control, but for connection. "I never wanted to be the man who arrived during chaos," he said quietly. "I wanted to be the one who stayed after it." Clara held his gaze. Stability. That word had shaped her decisions all year. Outside the restaurant windows, Manhattan pulsed with ambition as it always had. Markets rose and fell. Headlines shifted. CEOs came and went. But inside this moment, Clara felt something unshakable. Peace. Her son leaned against her shoulder, sleepy and content. Julian stood as she rose from the table, walking beside her toward the exit. There were no cameras, no public spectacle, just choice. Months ago, she had been brought to this restaurant as leverage. Tonight, she left it by her own decision. And as the cool night air wrapped around her, so Clara understood something final. She hadn't just survived the collapse. She had built a life no one could restructure. And just like that, the story closes. If you are still here with us right now, my friend, then something in this journey must have touched your heart. Maybe it wasn't the scandal. Maybe it wasn't the downfall. Maybe it was the quiet strength of a woman who refused to disappear. Let's look at this together. Clara's story reminds us that control is not the same as character. Power can build skyscrapers, but integrity builds peace. When everything fell apart, she didn't scream. She didn't seek revenge. She chose stability. And that choice changed everything. The Stoics teach us something powerful. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Clara couldn't control betrayal. She couldn't control the market. But she controlled her response, and that response rebuilt her life. Sometimes losing status is the beginning of finding yourself. Sometimes being erased forces you to remember who you truly are. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to rebuild, to stand steady when someone tried to diminish you, then you already understand the deeper lesson. Dignity is stronger than dominance. And if you're still here listening, still reflecting, then that means growth matters to you. So take a moment. Like this video if it spoke to you. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of their strength. And subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you stories that heal, challenge, and empower. Because sometimes, the greatest comeback is becoming who you were meant to be all along. This story is a fictional drama created for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, companies, financial events, and legal proceedings portrayed in this narrative are entirely imagined and are not based on any specific real individuals corporations, or ongoing investigations. While the story references real locations such as Manhattan and Wall Street to create an authentic atmosphere, these details are used purely for storytelling context. Any similarities to real events or persons are purely coincidental. The themes of corporate governance, financial responsibility, and personal growth are intended to offer reflection and life lessons, not to make factual claims about real businesses or public figures. This content does not present news reporting, its own legal advice, or financial guidance. It is a creative work designed to inspire discussion about integrity, accountability, and resilience in challenging life situations.